Good evening. Ambassador Carpenter, distinguished keynote speaker, panelists, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Ireland and Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce, you're very welcome. My name is Joe Huggard, and I serve as chairman of the Chamber. Before we move to the substance of this evening, I'd like to deal with one or two admin items. This evening's event has been streamed courtesy of the camera you can see behind you, and it's available on the ILCC website and also on Oxfam Ireland, and later on YouTube. Therefore, when we move to that portion of the evening where we'll take questions from the audience, I'd ask that you wait until we get a roving mic to you, otherwise those who are watching it on the internet won't be able to hear your question. I'd also ask that you give us your name and affiliation. Also, we have Conor Sweeney, who's toiling over a laptop here, and he's tasked with asking any questions that come into us from those watching online. And for those that may be watching, the hashtag, and this is all new to me, is #IrelandLux. That's one word, #IrelandLux. Finally, afterwards, there's a networking reception outside in the lobby, and I would particularly like to thank the Banque de Luxembourg, who made this wonderful auditorium available to us this evening. And I would also like to thank Athos, our other sponsor. One of the key objectives of the Chamber is the fostering of engagement between Ireland and Luxembourg as two small open economies, and focusing on areas that are in the policy sphere that are of mutual interest. This evening's event on fiscal sovereignty is designed to do just that fostering. When it comes to fiscal sovereignty, it's my firm view, and we've seen unfortunately a lot of that a recrimination fest is ultimately of no benefit to anybody and only serves to undermine public confidence in the whole system, and I think therein lies a real risk. What we need to do is to focus on a workable system. It's the Chamber's hope and belief that this evening will contribute to bringing light rather than heat to this discussion. Therefore, with such a distinguished lineup this evening, I would like to hand over to Keith O'Donnell, our moderator. Keith is a qualified tax advisor and accountant and managing partner at Athos. He has more than 25 years' experience of advising international groups on the design and implementation of global tax strategies. He also has served as experts on tax groups on the OECD and advising the European Commission. I think we're going to be in very safe hands with Keith. So, Keith.
Thank you, Joe. I think really my CV compared to the people sitting beside me is rather pathetic, actually. And as a result of which, one of my hardest jobs this evening was to summarize the CVs of all the people here, given all the experience they've had. And I'll run through briefly to introduce them and then to introduce our keynote speaker. The subject for this evening, just to kick off, is of particular personal interest because I'm one of these strange people in the world who really enjoys tax and tax policy. And the world is divided into two groups. There's the ones who find this really interesting, and we're a small little tribe, kind of like you can imagine lost in a rainforest. And then there's the rest of the world who find it desperately boring. Unless, of course, you have to deal with it. Not always because you've chosen to. And in this sense, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, because our first speaker, Rory Quinn, TD, and for those of you who aren't Irish, that means Member of Parliament, has been a Member of Parliament for many, many years and has a long and distinguished political career. What I think makes Rory's position particularly interesting is, notwithstanding the fact that he was an architect and a prominent one at that, and I saw he even spent time on a postgraduate program in Athens, Rory became the Minister of Finance in Ireland and was particularly remembered for implementing the Irish tax policy lowering the rate of corporation tax to 12.5% for corporations, which is a policy that has been very widely admired and occasionally reviled, generally out of jealousy, I think, as much as anything else. But Rory, being a politician, I think also will be keenly aware that having introduced a policy that was widely felt by many competitors to be brilliant, in the next election, of course, his party got voted out. And he was out of power for quite a long time in that party until there was a recent change. And now the party is back in, and that's the Labour Party, which makes another interesting point. Rory, as the architect of this tax policy, is in fact, by background, a Labour politician, which I think is an interesting message in itself, because sometimes the debate gets a bit polarised, and if you're in favour of low taxes, you must be right-wing, but in fact, I think, as we may learn this evening, sometimes the two aren't necessarily contradictory, and there can be a lot of social good coming out of tax policies that encourage business. So, beside Rory is Nicola Mackel. And Nicola Mackel, originally a lawyer, but nobody's perfect, has had a long diplomatic career and has represented Luxembourg at many international organizations, and then recently took up the role of CEO of Luxembourg for Finance. Luxembourg for Finance is the body, from bad to worse, he said. I don't think so. But he's been in the job for a brief period of time. It's been a very interesting period, because it has been the period when LuxLeaks became a buzzword in the press. So he's been there at a very interesting time, and I think most people recognize that he's also made a big contribution to the Luxembourg financial place while he's there. Sitting next to Nicola, we have Kevin. Kevin's got a very interesting background as well, in that he's worked as a civil servant in the Department of Finance for many years, until he recently moved to Luxembourg, where he sits in the Court of Auditors. And Kevin also had a particularly interesting role as Secretary General of the Department of Finance when Ireland was dealing with many of the difficult issues that led it, first of all, to basically going under financial assistance and subsequently emerging from that financial assistance. And then finally we have Jim Clarkin, who has also got a very interesting profile, in that Jim used to be a businessman, MBA student and everything else, and at a certain point in his life decided that there was more to life than business. Jim is now the CEO of Oxfam Ireland, and many of you may have heard of Oxfam. Not only are they a very big global charity that's contributed a huge amount to global development, but in addition they've been a very vocal contributor to the debate on globalization and equality and tax policy. I found it interesting to note in reading some of Oxfam's comments coming up to Davos, where Oxfam was explaining what it felt was necessary in the debate on globalization. And out of the 7-point plan, 2 of them were related to tax policy. So tax is rising up the agenda. So that was by way of a brief introduction to our panel tonight. And without further ado, I'd like to ask Rory to speak to us. And Rory will make some introductory comments over about 25 minutes. And then I'll ask each of the panel members to make a few comments as well over about 5 minutes, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. As Joe mentioned, if you have any questions in the meantime, you can tweet them, for those of you who know how to tweet. I personally haven't quite got there yet, but as far as I can see, everyone else has. So you can actually send those comments to the hashtag IrelandLux. And afterwards, we will have time among ourselves for a question and answer session as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for the invitation to be with you. And as I've asked you privately and publicly now again, give me the nod when my time is nearly up so I can land gracefully. All of what I want to say and all of what we're going to discuss, I believe, has to be placed in the context of globalization. Why start there? Globalization has been happening since the age of time, but from the point of view of where we are at the heart of Europe, it is relevant to realize that 523 years ago, Europeans began that long, extraordinary journey to colonize the rest of the world. Think of Seville, think of 1492, think of the departure of the Moors, who were the intellectually brightest people on the planet technologically at that time, and think of the discovery in 1525 of Francisco Pizarro of the treasures of the Inca. The rest, as they say, is history. All of us used to stress our nationality differences in this country, in this continent, but today we're Europeans. And our 500-year hegemony of the rest of the world has come to and is coming to an end. And we have to recognize that globalization is not some kind of political project. It is driven by technological advances that make new forms of transport, communication, and intervention possible. And that's why, in effect, the realization of that globalization informed in part the European Union project. It's appropriate for me in Luxembourg to pay tribute to the author of the first Werner report, or Werner Plan. Pierre Werner, Prime Minister of this country many years ago, in 1970, delivered a very, when you read it now, incredibly naive document to see how a single market could actually end up with a single currency. The ultimate logic of the completion of the internal market is a single currency, and some of us were reminiscing of earlier times when the plague that assaulted the Europe of the 1980s, 1990s, and earlier was currency fluctuation, massive devaluation, massive competitive interaction. And if you were buying and selling any kind of product and you had a 90-day credit line, in some days you ended up actually making a loss rather than a profit. So for all of my particular working life, both as a professional architect and as a politician, getting currency stability into a troubled continent was a dominant priority, something that would give us what the Germans seem to have in that Deutschmark region of a solid currency, low inflation, and low interest rates. Because without low interest rates, there is no investment. Because why would you take a risk when you can get 10, 12, 15% safely on deposit in a building society or in a bank? The single currency has brought us to the point where we now have the European Central Bank. We have now 19 members of that single currency. And under the leadership of Mario Draghi, I believe that the ECB is moving in the right direction in terms of treating the Eurozone and the European Union. And just a step back in history for a second, because while Europe has many admirers, we don't have as many friends as we think we have. Of our most lethal friends are those who would pretend to like and love us and admire us. I'm referring to the onslaught of continuous criticism that comes from American and British commentators of the economic failures of the European project, when in fact it's a weakly masked political attack on the very legitimacy of the project itself. For example, they will say that the Stability and Growth Pact failed. I helped with Jean-Claude Juncker and myself to actually bring that across the line in Dublin Castle in 1996. It didn't fail. Stability and Growth Pact failed, if you want to call it that, because it was ignored first by Germany and then by France. And then when little Portugal went offside, it got the yellow card. It was a political decision to abandon the rigors of discipline that we have put in place. The single currency area will always require expenditure and budgetary rules that are both understood, recognized, and implemented. And this is where some of the problems are currently with some of the member states who got into trouble. But the benefits to date of the low interest rate, low inflation, and a stable currency have now been taken completely for granted, as I said earlier on. And the establishment of the single currency not only stabilized the euro area, including all those fluctuating currencies, but it also had a knock-on effect on the stability of sterling and the stability of the US dollar. When did you last see speculation about currency fluctuation of the kind that many of you in this room can remember 10, 15, or 20 years ago? It's gone off the horizon. Things like that don't happen by accident. It has to be understood that this single currency project was both an economic project and a political project. And many of the economic criticisms are simply cover for political antagonism. However, it is most important from my point of view to recognize that the fiscal sovereignty of member states must not be confused with the establishment and operation of a single currency area. We've had single currency areas before, the gold standard being one of them, that didn't in any way undermine the sovereignty of a member state or a sovereign state. And therefore, what we're moving towards to discuss now, and that is the whole question of taxation, is that the stability of a single currency that gives us all the benefits that we're talking about should not be confused with the fiscal sovereignty of member states, and in particular the fiscal sovereignty of member states within a European Union such as we have, which is internationally unique. And another point before I move on. The banking crisis, the consequences of which we are still struggling with, it did not start within Europe. It was not a product of the single currency. The contagion began in the United States because of the subprime subterfuge and whatever way you would like to politely, I'm conscious that I'm being streamed internationally, I don't want to, but there was less than 100% percentage performance in some of the products. But let's be realistic. Where did the banking crisis originate from? It did not arise or originate because of the inherent contradictions, as some would suggest, within the European project. So, globalization, recent history, they tell us stories. They don't teach us lessons. History doesn't teach us lessons. We have to learn those ourselves. And in learning that lesson, I would believe that the following things we need to do are as such. We have a globalized and globalizing world economy. That process is going to accelerate. It's certainly not going to reverse. All market economies, whether they're local, regional, national, or indeed global, need regulation. Starting from the weights and measures of medieval Europe to what we've had with customs standards and a whole host of other things. You can't have a fair, free, competitive market operating efficiently if it isn't properly regulated. Imagine a World Cup without proper referees. It would be chaos. A global economy, market economy, without proper regulations perceived and understood and implemented by those people charged with that responsibility will not function either. And we're on the threshold of that. And in the area that has brought us here today and this evening in Luxembourg, in the Irish Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce, it's over the perception of unfair manipulation or application of fiscal rules in a global or a globalizing world economy. Tax planning and tax avoidance, not evasion, on a global scale will always exist. And in a global market with global players, the opportunities for that to be done are enormous. It is the responsibility of the regulators, in my view, and the political masters of regulation to look at where and how we need to, in fact, introduce regulations that make sense and are recognized both in Europe, in America, and in the rest of the world. From that point of view, as far as I'm concerned, the best place in which to start, and the only place in which to start, is with the OECD. And the OECD BEPS process, that's the base erosion of the delivery of revenue, is where we can start to make an advance into this area. Because at least the 40 largest, most advanced economies in the world are represented in the OECD, and there are a number of other emerging economies that want to become part of the OECD as well. Now, where does that leave Ireland and Luxembourg? As far as I'm concerned, small member states, our combined population, incidentally, out of a population of 500 million in the European Union, the combined population of the state, or the Duchy of Luxembourg, and that of the Republic of Ireland is less than 6 million. So we're not big fish. But because we're small fish, we're very agile. And we need to be able to maintain that agility as we navigate the different currents and the different rivers that make up the world's economy and how it impacts the European Union. We have, and I'll speak now on behalf of my own experience in the Republic of Ireland, at all stages, and continue to operate an open and clear and transparent taxation system that is subject to the rule of law, in which there are no favours given to certain companies or to certain individuals or to certain bodies coming from a particular point of view or from a particular location. The 12.5% taxation regime came about as a requirement on our part, and as was said earlier, I was Minister for Finance at the time. We had two taxation rates in Ireland. We had a 10% taxation on internationally traded services rate, and we had a 40%, or initially 40%, from the scrutiny and from the examination of commentators. Where we are now, and following LuxLeaks and other types of speculation, is an envy, and I use my word advisedly, an envy that a small country like Luxembourg and a small country like Ireland can, in our case, over a relatively short period of time. We only had our independent currency since 1979. Prior to that, we were part of the sterling area. Last year's finance bill, which became law and which we are now suggesting you should change if you so choose from a policy point of view. But at no stage was the identity of the company or the legal advisors who had actually found, explored and exploited that particular loophole to their clients' legal advantage during the point of that time. I understand, but it's up to others speaking tonight to say that that is not unusual and that is a similar process to what is happening in other jurisdictions. One final political point. Just because we're small doesn't mean that people like us. Just because we are parcel of a very large political and economic union of 28 member states, the only political entity, as I said earlier today, that has countries wishing to apply to join it. There are tensions, there are all sorts of concerns in all of the 28 member states, and we have to be aware of that. But I'll finish on this point. We have a product that other people want to use and want to avail of and are prepared to pay a good market price from our point of view, and provide very good employment in a globalizing world economy. So does Luxembourg. The kind of publicity that we have seen in some of the more populist press is not, in fact, a true reflection of what it is that I believe that we do. However, the relentless path and progress of globalization is such that we have to recognize that even if we are aware of that, we have to make sure that we are doing it in the most effective and efficient and transparent way possible. Thank you.
Nicolas, would you like to make a few comments? Now, we've had Rory's point of view, a small country that doesn't have islands but is an island. Now we have within Europe a small country that not only isn't an island, although you could say an island in the middle of Europe, but certainly doesn't have any islands. Do you think Luxembourg has the same view of its place in Europe and its role within the globalizing world?
Well, first of all, let me start by apologizing. I think I'm the only one on this panel without this beautiful Irish accent, so you have to make do with my poor Luxembourgish accent. Second, let me thank also the Irish Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce for organizing this event. I think it's a very good opportunity to address this very timely issue. And yes, let me continue there where Rory has set out and put out a very interesting and stimulating framework for our debate this evening. I think there were so many points I could at least talk for the next half an hour on some of them, especially the island bit, where I've been busy, as you have referred to, rebutting certain notions about Luxembourg. And let me maybe start exactly there. I think being from a small country, and I suppose you have exactly the same sort of feeling, what you are constantly facing is, let's put it politely as I'm a diplomat, a certain level of absence of information about Luxembourg. Not to say full ignorance about Luxembourg. People who live in big countries tend not to be interested in what happens in small countries. Like the other way around, we do learn history from about Germany, about France, about the UK. Of course, the other way around is apparently not possible, but maybe someday the European education policy will change that. Now, the fact is that this ignorance leads to a certain number of preconceived ideas, and these preconceived ideas always revolve around the same thing, and that is something we have to rebut. But there was another point in Rory's speech that I would like to address, and that is that of the EU single market. In your introduction, you mentioned that the single currency is actually the conclusion of the perfection of the single market. Now, the single market, even though we have a single currency, albeit imperfect, is itself far from being completed. And as we have seen since the financial crisis, much and much less so. In fact, what is happening is that the walls that we have taken 60 years to bring down of market segmentation have, since the financial crisis, gone back up in many respects. And that is something that leads to questioning of why certain companies from outside the European Union would want to choose smaller countries, Ireland or Luxembourg, to set up their European operations. Why would they not choose Ireland or Luxembourg? Look at them. I mean, Rory said we were agile fish. Oh yes, we are. I have two boys, twin boys. One of them is, because he eats differently, a little bit stronger and taller than the other. And so when the two play, for instance, football, and the smaller one scores, of course the other one shouts foul, because it's not possible that the small guy can beat him in anything. He must be cheating somewhere. And so the same more or less goes, and Rory mentioned it as well. No, in fact, we have to adapt. We have to be more agile, and that is exactly what we are. We have to be more open to innovation. That is what Luxembourg is really building its strength on. Being open to innovation, being open to new ideas. It maybe also comes with the fact of being a small country. You listen more to what is happening around you than when you're when you're a large economy. You're more used to the others listening to you. Luxembourg has built a number of success stories about this openness to innovation. Now, Luxembourg also has a number of other features, and I think Ireland as well. I've known a lot of Irish civil servants in my career, and just like Luxembourg, Ireland has a very small civil service. That is one of the strengths that makes Luxembourg really an attractive destination to companies. Why? Well, because it gives you relatively direct access to decision makers. It makes for very speedy responsiveness. What we keep hearing from companies that try in larger countries is that, well, it's very, very complicated unless you're one of the really big companies. And even then, there are perfect examples of some of the world's largest corporations that have chosen Luxembourg or Ireland, and have chosen Luxembourg or Ireland not only for tax reasons. Now let me get to the point of taxes, because otherwise you will tell me that I have dodged the bullet. No, taxes are of course any company's consideration. If you are the CFO of any company, you are under fiduciary duty to reduce the costs. Now you may look at taxes as your civic duty, or if you're the CFO, you may look at it as costs. Either way, all of us citizens, I don't cheat the taxes, but I do try to reduce what I consider the costs. Companies is relatively the same. And any multinational, in the case of, Keith mentioned the word LuxLeak, has played by the rules. I think even all the articles in the newspapers have mentioned that there were no rules violated. No international, no Luxembourgish rules. By the way, there were no specific Luxembourgish rules that granted any sort of advantage to any of these companies. So it's simply the international rule framework that was played out by the companies. Now you may think of this what you want, and I think the Luxembourg government has made its position relatively clear that we do not condone double non-taxation, but the problem doesn't lie necessarily with us. The problem lies with the set of rules, and the set of rules have been defined either by democratically elected governments or by international organizations where democratically elected governments sit together. And that is what we need to change. We have said this from the outset, even before, long before any article mentioned LuxLeak or whatever it was, because we have taken an active and positive part in the BEPS discussion that Rory referred to at OECD level. That is the only instance where we can actually change any of this. And that is what we intend to do. So that much for my introduction.
Thank you, Lenny. Thanks, Nicola. Yes, and if you could pass the speaker down. So Kevin, maybe looking at this now, if I could ask you to take a perspective on it as a civil servant within a Department of Finance, seeing this tax policy evolve over time very successfully in Ireland, then seeing it, and I'd like to think it wasn't linked at all to that particular tax policy, but also seeing Ireland's tax situation crash tested by the financial crisis. Could you give us some insights as to how a tax policy like this, which is clearly very favourable for international business, very competitive, how that plays out within a budgetary environment seen as a civil servant within a Department of Finance, and what lessons, if any, would you take from that for the future?
Oh, okay, thanks. That's
This wasn't prepared at all, so I just lobbed this one at him. It's called a hospital pass in rugby terms.
I'll try and dive. Okay, if you're sitting in a finance ministry as an official, if you're good and conscientious, you try to avoid sort of a doctrinary approach, but you especially try to avoid being captured by the industry interest. There's a sort of a sense in some places that Luxembourg, Ireland, other places are pro-business as a reflex, unthinkingly, or pro-secrecy as a reflex, unthinkingly. If you're in a finance ministry, your job is not to be unthinking, it is to consider why you are making policy changes. And if the policy changes have a cost, you have to think, what is the return on that investment? And for an official, the most wonderful type of tax change is one which generates employment at no cost. And employment is generally the thing you're looking for rather than income, because employment has all sorts of social benefits that go beyond simply the income that's produced. And there are many, believe it or not, many tax adjustments that have no cost. Almost anybody. There are multiple opportunities to remove obstacles to trade, obstacles to business, in ways that don't really do anyone any harm. Maybe someone 20 years before had thought they could raise some tax in a particular way, but it turns out an industry can't exist with that tax. So you remove the tax, the theoretical tax, and suddenly you have a new industry. And that happens more than you would think. But when you get to the broader, the high level thinking, you know, things like a 12.5% rate, things like the BEPS and those kinds of things, well, you have to be more nuanced, and you have to be thinking all the time about what is best for the welfare of your people, not for the welfare of the businesses. So the businesses come in and they do their pre-budget submissions and they say, we want this tax adjustment, it will be good for us, and of course they make all sorts of promises about the new employment it will generate. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it just generates employment in one place that would have been generated somewhere else and so forth. So it's all about evaluation. But it's also somewhat about ethics and equality and equity within your society. So we used to have a wonderful thing called the remittance basis of taxation, which allowed senior executives from other parts of the world to come to Ireland, pay not much tax, really only pay on the income they used within Ireland, and it was fantastic for bringing in skilled people. And then we discovered that actually a very clever company in Jersey was using it to as a mechanism for paying hundreds, thousands indeed, of building workers in Dublin. And this was not at all what it was intended for, so we put a stop to it straight away, and there was all sorts of outcry, you can't do this. But think about what the issue was. There were two equity issues that were both very important. The first equity issue was, why should, just happens they were mostly Turkish construction workers in Dublin get a tax break that Irish construction workers wouldn't get? And then in some ways the bigger issue, why should it be that the people who are already wealthy, high earning, get an extra tax break because of who they are? Now we had a good reason for that. It was to bring particular skills into Ireland that were needed in Ireland. So the balance was there, the balance could be struck, and since then we've reintroduced, or my former colleagues have reintroduced a form of this that should be better balanced than the previous. So we are always trying to judge this benefit, welfare for your people, including equity, these equity concerns. And then you look at the international situation, you look what's happening now, and you ask yourself, well, why is it that there's this apparent attack on smaller countries with particular types of tax system? Like, is this just overblown rhetoric with a competitive and slightly nasty overtone of people who don't quite understand what we're doing, who don't listen to us, but they want to steal our jobs and our competitive advantage? Or is it a genuine moral outcry from citizens of Europe and other parts of the world who believe that these kinds of tax practices are incorrect? And is it perhaps a balanced, objective and an agenda-free program. Well, I can tell you it's not that. There is no place in Europe that does tax, no government, no company that does tax on an agenda-free basis. It just doesn't happen. Loads of agendas. They're so complicated as to be almost impossible to work out sometimes. But we do have to respond to the questions that people are asking us, whether or not it arises from a competitive attack or whether it is genuinely a sort of a moral outrage. We have to address it for pragmatic reasons because it has real impacts on our business models going forward, whether we be Irish, Luxembourg, or from any other part of Europe. And we have to address it because, from a principle point of view, we have to, as European countries, have regard to the effects of what we do on other countries around us. That's a little bit of what the European community, being a community, is about. We're not entitled to compete entirely without regard to what is happening among our neighbours. So where should we stand? If there's all this uncertainty, where should our firm ground be? I think first, legality. There are, notwithstanding fiscal sovereignty and national rules and so forth, there are lots of sets of international rules. There are OECD guidelines, there's model treaties, there's transparency rules, saving directives, state aid rules, codes of conduct, all sorts of rules. And we should stand on those. We should stand on legality, and we shouldn't seek to bend. We should stand with the spirit and not just the words of the rules. Secondly, we should stand on transparency. I asked a tax official once who was complaining about what he called abusive tax avoidance practices, and I said, well, okay, I'm equally outraged, but how do we distinguish between abusive and ordinary tax avoidance? And his answer was really quite well considered. He said, it's very hard to define precisely. He wasn't able to do it. But if it is something that people feel needs to be hidden, then that's a good starting point in wondering whether there is an abuse. So we should stand on, all the countries in Europe should stand on transparency. Thirdly, we should stand on responsiveness. The world is changing, tax practices are changing, the technologies of tax avoidance, as creative and wonderful as they are fast developing. And it's unreasonable, therefore, for us to expect that nothing will change, that the rules will stay the same and we can just play within them. We have to accept that rules will change sometimes and that the context will change. And pragmatically, at the very least from a pragmatic point of view, also possibly morally, we have to respond to external pressure in a reasonable and thoughtful way. We don't have to concede, we don't have to surrender, but it makes good sense and is possibly also the right thing to do, to be responsive and thoughtful about how we deal with the concerns of our neighbours. And finally, I think we should think a little bit and stand on the benefits of competitiveness. I tried to say, when I'm discussing this, I say to people, look, why does Renault make many different kinds of cars? Why isn't there just one Renault? If Renault produces one really good car, why do they produce others? And the answer is because different types of customers need different types of products. And we in Europe have many different types of customers. We have many different potential investors, potential inward investors, many different potential buyers of our goods. And actually there is a strength for Europe in having a range of different offerings. So the people that Ireland is trying to attract to Ireland, to its jurisdiction in inward investment terms, are not exactly the same set as the UK wants. There's overlap, of course. They're not exactly the same set as Luxembourg wants. They're not exactly the same set as France. And by having a range of tax offerings, we become more competitive vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And as we go forward the next 20 or 30 years, our 400 or 500 million people, it's going to be quite a small subset of the 7 or 8 or 9 billion people there are going to be in the world. So we are going to have to be competitive, and different tax practices allow for that greater European competitiveness. So that's, I don't know if that handles your hospital pass, but that's as good as I can do.
Admirably, you're rushing towards the try line from the start. So Jim, over to you now. We've had, shall we say, one view of tax policy quite linked to globalization and legality. Now, I think Oxfam's been quite vocal in saying, well, maybe there's a little more to just economics and legality in tax, and that it should be achieving more. So, do you want to make some introductory comments there, Jim, on this?
Sure. First of all, could I say thank you to Joe Huggard and the Ireland Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce and all of you this evening for inviting me to be here. My first time in Luxembourg, so it's very nice. And it's great to be on a forum with these speakers and talking about this issue. And it's interesting, you know, we're talking about two small open economies that rely on innovation, enterprise and exports. And there's been a lot of criticism of both Ireland and Luxembourg in the last year or two. And in the course of all that criticism, there's been very little mention of what taxation actually does. So what it does in terms of creating the environment for business to thrive. The education, the communications networks, the infrastructure, the hospitals, and providing safety nets to ensure that inequality is prevented in extremes. And this is all thanks to the taxation that we talk about. Yet nowadays, in many forums, taxation is considered to be something to be avoided at all costs. It's an evil. It's a state, nanny state, trying to prevent progress, to prevent companies and individuals from progressing. And I suppose the reason that Oxfam cares about these issues is it has such an extremely deep global dimension, particularly in terms of the causes and the kind of, I suppose, challenges of poverty and how we can change the trajectory. In the last 15 years, the world has made tremendous strides in reducing extreme poverty, nearly by half. And lots of other indicators have been very successful in terms of poor people in developing countries particularly. But in recent years, we've seen that the extent of inequality that is emerging is having a very detrimental effect on this ongoing process. And there's a real fear that it might either slow down or actually reverse some of the gains that have been made. And Oxfam find ourselves in a strange position where we're agreeing furiously with the IMF and the World Economic Forum and President Obama and people who wouldn't ordinarily be allies of an organization like Oxfam, maybe for different reasons, but they also identify that inequality is a major blocker to development and to prosperity. You might have heard the 85 people statistic that we produced in advance of the Davos meeting last year, which was that the 85 wealthiest people in the world own the same amount of wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people. That's 85 people. It's less than the number of people in this room. And this year, our report, a follow-on report, identified that the 1% of wealthiest people own half of the entire world's wealth, half of everything. So, inequality is growing and it's getting out of control and it is holding the world back. And one of the great ways for us to deal with inequality is to look at taxation to rebalance this. And however, when we look at the global taxation system, the structures, systems and practices that are designed to avoid, evade and dodge tax at an industrial scale. And this affects everybody. It affects people here just as much as it affects people in developing countries. But just to talk about developing countries first, we estimate that the tax gap, that's the lack of tax revenue for developing country governments, is about 91 billion euros every year. 91 billion euros. That is the tax, that is the entitlement of the citizens of those countries. That's the tax that they should have in order to pay for their essential services. And it is not being paid through a whole complexity of structures and methods to avoid and evade tax. And just to give you a few examples, the National Board of Revenue of Bangladesh estimates that companies siphon off about 1.8 billion from the country each year due to weak transfer pricing oversight. that should amount to about $310 million of taxation, which would pay for more than 20% of the entire education budget for that country, a poor country that needs education. The Niger is the country that is on the lowest, it's the lowest country in the Human Development Index. It's the poorest country in the world, essentially, with over 60% of the population living on $1 a day or less. Yet it's the fourth largest exporter of uranium. You probably didn't know that. And most of that uranium goes to a French company, Areva. And because of the various systems that were negotiated or strong-armed to the Niger government when they needed some kind of investment, there is a tiny trickle of flow to the Nigerian government for that, both in terms of taxation, for the extractive, in terms of VAT, and in terms of profit tax too. Now they're in a position now where they can actually start to renegotiate it. And even a tiny change to the VAT element of that could pay for 200,000 primary school children to go to school. So these are huge impacts. I mean, one final one for you. The British food company ABF generated profits of about $123 million in Zambia on the sugar industry and paid almost zero tax. And this is something they seem to be quite proud of. The 27 million that should have derived from that would have paid for 48,000 Zambian children in school every year. And finally, one that kind of struck home, I guess, or struck this part of the world a little bit more than a lot of those developing country issues where people can switch off your TV easily enough, was the Ebola crisis. Well, the Ebola crisis struck West Africa, as you know, in the last year or so, and Liberia was one of the worst affected countries. Liberia is about the size of Ireland and Luxembourg put together, about 6 million people. It has 51 qualified doctors, 51, for the entire population. Now, if that country had the tax revenue that it is entitled to, it could have a much more robust health system. So, you know, the impact of tax arrangements that move and siphon money from developing countries into other parts of the world have a very, very human impact, a very real impact. And there is a second one, which I suppose is maybe more pertinent in some ways to this discussion, is the impact of tax competition. So we have been very careful not to be critical of the Irish entitlement to have its sovereign tax rate, and no more than Luxembourg, it's a key pillar to the development and to the economic success of small open economies like ours. But yet, what we have seen is that this has been used as a lever to force developing countries to compete in a way that is unaffordable for them. Developing countries depend far more on corporation tax revenue than this part of the world for their overall revenue pot to pay for those services. So every time they reduce their taxation, it is reducing disproportionately the amount of money available to pay for everything. So it is a concern, this so-called race to the bottom. Now, as I say, I measure that carefully, and that we have been slow to criticize these countries, our countries, for that, because there are other reasons for it. But we do have to look at what's known as the spillover analysis, and to ensure that whatever we do in this part of the world doesn't have consequences that we haven't intended. And to be fair, there is a process in place to look at that. And I suppose you'd ask, why do we care about revenue returns here? I mean, obviously, it has an impact on, you know, and revenue that's lost from developing countries condemns people to a life of poverty. But even here, women surviving on part-time work, zero contracts, etc., carry the burden of care for domestic work, children born into the homes of employment. Inequality hinders economic growth. It corrupts politics, and it robs people of a fair chance in life. And when we say it corrupts politics, when you have extreme forms of inequality, there is a different type of access to wealthy people and large corporates, to people with the hands on the levers of power, than there are for ordinary citizens. And we have to watch that very carefully, because policies can be put in place that benefit that part of society and not the overall. So I suppose the other element to it is, why should businesses care? I mean, the kind of thesis is that businesses their job is to maximize profit. And my background is in business, and I absolutely don't disagree with that in many ways. And it's up to the state and the global system to prevent them or to encourage different types of behavior. But think about the reputational element to this. And I'll give you an example of, you know what happened obviously with HSBC, but if you think about what happened with Starbucks, and Starbucks being strong-armed into pay tax that they really didn't want to. While that was happening, Costa Coffee, who were one of their competitors, made a virtue of the fact that they were paying the full 25% tax. And they actually grabbed quite a percentage of the market share from Starbucks during that time. Citizens care about this stuff. And if citizens care, their consumers care, companies need to care too. And countries, we were very, I suppose, positive about the announcement made at the last budget in Ireland of the scrapping of the double tax. It was one of those things that did not enhance Ireland's reputation, and we know it was abused by many companies to channel funds through Ireland where revenue really wasn't generated. So, and again, to Ireland's credit, it has been very upfront in terms of its engagement with the BEPS process. And it's going to be one of the countries that kind of tries to lead that way. Now, we would argue that the BEPS process itself isn't perfect because it excludes the vast majority of the population of the world. It includes the wealthiest countries, but it doesn't include developing countries. And if you're going to have global tax compact, you need to have developing countries involved. So work needs to be done on that. But it is a start, and it's a good start. And what we're looking for is a global tax compact that includes all countries. Country by country reporting, so that we're very clear on where revenue and profit is made and where it's taxed, and that this is part of international transparent registries that are available for the public, not just between governments and bilateral arrangements, but for the public to gain access to, so that civil society and others can challenge where they feel this is not proportionate. Obviously implementing the anti-money laundering directive and an automatic exchange of tax information. And as I say, getting back to this spillover analysis to be sure that whatever we're doing doesn't cause inadvertent detrimental effects on developing countries. But there's a trajectory we're on, which is the start of a journey, which is a positive thing, I believe. But we need to keep it focused and we need to move it on and remember that BEPS is only the start of it.
Thank you, Jim. That was a lot of ground covered in a very short period of time, and I think there's a lot of ideas in there that I'd like to come back to. But maybe the first one I'd like to get the panel's views in no particular order is to focus on tax competition, because it's clear within Europe, but also within the global economy, there is tax competition. And maybe as a way of framing this question, I'm going to start off by asking, first of all, Rory, and then Nicolas. Both Ireland and Luxembourg have to some extent been targeted. The label tax havens been used. Ireland was particularly aimed because people said, well, hang on, you've just been bailed out by the EU and the IMF, and you still have this 12.5% tax rate. How can we have a tax haven that we're funding in addition? And then maybe I'd like to ask a similar question to Nicolas, who's been working hard on this, on the message around LuxLeaks, where to some extent Luxembourg was on the receiving end of similar criticism. Maybe let's start with you, Rory. The tax haven point. Is Ireland a tax haven in the heart of Europe? Is that fair?
No, it's not a tax haven. It's a transparent place, and our taxation system has been transparent from day one. When the 10%, or when the country was attempting to industrialize and going back to the 50s and 60s, we had a zero tax rate on manufactured goods that were exported. We were trying to generate employment in an agricultural economy that had massive immigration. That moved up the line to the point where we had a 10% taxation rate because we were obliged to, or we decided to have it. I don't know the exact history. Other people in this room might be better informed, but we were taking on international obligations and we were applicants for membership of the European Union. And I suspect that some of the pressure to have that tax base there. But the companies who came to Ireland came for 5 or 6 reasons. And for 2 years I was Minister for Enterprise and Employment. And in no particular order of priority. They came for the political stability that Ireland offered. Some of my colleagues in my own party would regard that as the innate conservatism of Irish society, but they saw it as political stability. And there is no investment if there isn't stability. Secondly, they came because there was a skilled and trained and educated workforce. Thirdly, they came because the rule of law was very manifest, and as Nicolas has said earlier on, the lines of communication and even access to courts in those days was fairly quick, and you got judicial decisions that were seen to be clear and objective and not open to manipulation or to bribery or to purchase. They also came for something that was never officially put out into the literature because it went against the nationalist narrative at that time, but because we are and were then, and it was a big attraction for them, an English-speaking location, and we provided, finally, access to a vast market, because they didn't come to Ireland to service the Irish market. They came to Ireland so that they could actually access the growing European market, of which Ireland was a base for those sort of reasons. Tax was a part of that mix. It was a part of that mix, and over time, as our costs got out of control, and particularly during the period of exuberance, shall we call it, irrational exuberance, I think one former chairman of the Fed described it, our costs got out of control. Back in 1997, when we left government, we were one of the most competitive economies in Europe. That was quickly eroded. So wage costs, transaction costs in terms of transport and communications eroded a lot of our overall competitiveness. But people didn't come to Ireland, and still don't come to Ireland, because of an advantageous tax system per se and on its own. It is part of the mix.
Developing itself into a tertiary economy. But how did you view the attacks on Luxembourg? Again, similar labels being used. And what was the communication to rebut them?
Well, I think the communication to rebut them was very straightforward, explaining what Luxembourg is. Now, I very well understand where the criticisms come from, the origin of which is in fact what I keep referring to as our original sin, namely the existence of banking secrecy on Luxembourg's statute books. That is what gave our critics the perceived entitlement to see Luxembourg as an opaque country. Now, what very few people knew is that banking secrecy in Luxembourg has never been absolute. Banking secrecy in Luxembourg has been eroded over the last years anyway. And anyway, ever since 2009, when we introduced exchange of information upon request, no client of any bank in Luxembourg could reasonably believe that his tax information would not be shared with the authorities of the country of his residence. In terms of anti-money laundering, I think we are members of OECD and thus of FATF, where we have received a clean bill of health. So we are part of the international community, apply the set of rules that apply to all other EU countries and to all other OECD countries. We have very, very unequivocally committed to transparency. I think the last government already and the new government in particular have taken a very firm stand towards transparency, embracing transparency as the global community has. I mean, let's remember 2009, nobody asked for automatic exchange yet at that time. It was exchange of information upon request. Then we realized that that was not going to be enough. Have you ever heard Luxembourg at OECD say, no, we don't want it? When we made a mistake, and that was to, at a European level, say, we think that we should only introduce exchange, automatic exchange of information when the Swiss and the other Europeans do the same thing. But what nobody had heard was the part of the sentence where our Minister of Finance at the time said, we fundamentally agree in principle. So This is settled. Luxembourg has committed to automatic exchange of information, by the way, since January 1st, 2015. So a month and a half now, we are applying it on the basis of the existing directive. And in the future, in 2017, Luxembourg is among the early adopters of the new extended scope and of OECD's common reporting standards. So we are on exactly the same foot as all other OECD countries in this regard. When the Luxembourg government voiced its support for the European Commission's plan to suggest or to submit a proposal for an automatic exchange of rulings, a part of our finance minister, I haven't heard anybody else voicing support for that. But we did, and that was not only because of LuxLeaks. For us, I mean, there's nothing fishy about the presence of these multinationals in Luxembourg. And if I may add to what Rory has just recited as arguments for these companies, in Luxembourg also, one of the elements, but Ireland as well, I mean, there was a small interval, but that is economic stability, fiscal stability. Luxembourg is, if you look at the map of Europe, we have a 22.8% public debt. Now that may sound like an argument between macroeconomists, but in fact, when you talk to investors, it translates into a much lower pressure to increase taxes than in a country that has a much higher public debt. And that is what investors are looking for, predictability. They don't want to know that, well, maybe we're going to change the rules next year. We will have elections, and as you know, elections change people and people change policies. No, Luxembourg is also in that, just as Ireland, committed to stability. And there is an unspoken rule between governments that on certain fundamental issues, we do not fiddle around. And that is extremely important for investors. There's another point, and I come back to what I said initially, which is the responsiveness of authorities. And here I would like to make a small point about our critics transforming whatever point we consider one of our strengths into another point of criticism. Namely, when we talk about Luxembourg being business friendly, as Kevin said before, or responsive, we are told, well, in fact, you are just basically, I mean, the government is in bed with the industry or with business. You are doing exactly what the industry is asking you to do. No. What wrong is there for the government to listen to what business is voicing in terms of needs? I think it's good for the country, it's good for growth, thus for jobs, and ultimately for tax revenues that will be going to objectives like the ones you pursue. Did you know that Luxembourg is one of only 3 countries in the world that has fulfilled its Millennium Development Goals?
Jim, with that one teed up, I think I'd like to get your views on this, and still on the point of tax competition, because there's kind of 2 extreme views of tax competition. One says that ultimately it's a kind of a beggar thy neighbor approach, and it's a race towards the bottom because country A drops its rate to 28, so country B drops it to 26, so country A drops it to 24, and you end up at 0. Another view of the world is that if you look at a lot of the developing countries, they do, to attract inward investment, introduce tax holidays. And if you look at a map of tax holidays across the world, they're hugely concentrated in developing countries. So do you think that tax competition is per se something harmful, or does it have a role in international policy both for developed and developing countries?
Whether we like it or not, it's there, and it's going to be there. So I think we've got to deal with the reality that's in front of us. I suppose the difficulty that we have is because the current systems are so opaque, it's really not clear what we mean, even in that instance. I mean, you know, one would argue that because of the previous arrangements in Ireland, you know, even though the headline rate was very clear and it wasn't something we argued with, it was the way other systems were being manipulated to move money was problematic, both from for individuals as well as for corporates. And, you know, obviously, and I mentioned it earlier, developing countries depend more on corporation tax for their revenue than this part of the world. So it's quite damaging then when they feel they have to compete at such a rate that that's going to be continually minimized. But that said, you know, if it was transparent, if it was progressive in that it could move over time once certain, you know, development criteria were met, etc., if it was also matched with the generosity of the Luxembourg aid budget, for example, and others, then it could be workable. It could be workable. But what we have at the moment is a system where few enough, as you say, only 3 countries have complied with their MDG commitments in terms of funding for development, but also the opaqueness at which money is moved from developing countries at the moment, even with their generous tax incentives, means that actually the real rate of taxes can be almost nil.
Yeah, that raises another interesting point. You picked up on it, which was the whole, and I'd like to get the panel's views on this, on the transparency question. But there's 2 views of the world. There's the really old one, which is to say, okay, you know, banking secrecy, clearly a thing of the past, in tax matters certainly. And then we move on to another area which you mentioned, country by country reporting. In the initial versions of the BEPS report, there was a sense that this information might be made public. Now, there's been a rollback on that, and finally the attitude is to say no, it'll be exchanged among governments, but it won't be a publicly available information. And I must say, speaking on behalf of, you know, some of my clients here, they also said they found the idea of public country-by-country reporting very damaging for 2 reasons, and one you might agree with and one you mightn't. The first one they said was, well, it's competitively sensitive information. From this, our competitors can see our margins in countries, our strategies, and basically copy them and compete unfairly. The second one that was raised, they said quite openly, if we get the wrong answer in any country, we don't have to worry about dealing with the tax authority anymore. We're just going to be crucified by the public and by the press. And this has happened repetitively, rightly or wrongly. So they're basically saying you'd have shifted tax from being a policy matter in the hands of governments into the hands of a lynch mob or the equivalent. So it's perhaps a slightly dramatized way of putting it, but what's your view on that? I mean, do you accept those are legitimate criticisms of full transparency for country-by-country reporting?
No, not at all. First of all, by the lynch mob, you mean the population, you mean the people, you mean the citizens. Okay, so I can't accept that at any level, okay? This is the taxation that they own, by the way. The company has made profit through whatever it might be, through the extractives industry, through some value add in relation to that, through minerals, through agriculture, which is absolutely fine. They've made a profit. The taxation from that profit is owned by the citizens. And they absolutely have an entitlement to know what that is. And the lynch mob being the citizens, I think absolutely need to see that. As for the competitive information, we've come up against this before, but there are ways in which it can be structured that it doesn't have to give away the minutiae while still providing the information that's required. So I think it's a little bit of what do you call it, what's that expression? Red herring, that's the one, sorry. In terms of the worry that companies will have that they'll suddenly give away the entire secrecy of how they make their money. So I wouldn't agree with either of them, to be perfectly honest, because we have explored and we have analysed that to quite an extent. The reason that they don't want it, of course, is because it enables them to continue with the system that exists at the moment. And just finally back to the exchange of information. Developing country governments don't have the revenue capacity that countries like ours have. They just don't have it. It needs to be developed and built. It needs, and actually aid budgets are very useful in that regard, building those types of structures in country. But until they have that, they won't be in a position to exchange on a bilateral basis or a multilateral basis. That's why we want them to be open. And we have never heard a strong enough argument why that couldn't happen.
Okay, maybe Kevin, to get your view on that as kind of if I can simplify your capacities as being the Department of Finance civil servant, could you imagine a system where that kind of information in relation to corporate taxpayers was made public?
I think, well, for a person in that situation, it's all about employment, growth, economic impact. And that relates to competitiveness, and that in turn relates to whether the rules are the same for everybody. Difficulty is you're talking about everybody on a global scale, because you're not just competing in Europe, you're competing globally. So I think it would be a very nuanced question, but I think the answer would be, will it be an OECD-sponsored global or quasi-global action, or will it just be within a subset? And if it's just a subset, that creates a different set of problems.
Rory, do you have a view on that one?
Well, I think, as I said in my earlier remarks, and I elaborated them earlier today, globalization is not reversible. The variables are the speed at which it proceeds, the way technology opens up possibilities that don't currently exist. I mean, if anybody in this building or its predecessor had said 10, 15 years ago, Nicola, that we would have had something like LuxLeaks or the opening up of financial data out of HSBC by the French employee, etc., or the Snowden information that came in the security domain while the Cold War was still on and while the Berlin Wall still existed, it would have been the end of civilization as we would have perhaps contemplated. And we have moved on, and we're moving on for a whole variety of factors. And therefore raging against those factors over which we have little controls is not terribly productive. It may be great for the heart and the head to get it off your chest, but it doesn't change the situation the following morning. I think the recognition that globalization is going to continue, it's rooted in non-political factors such as technological development and empowerment. Think of the empowerment that people in the whole of Africa have had from mobile phones. They've jumped 3 technologies in one in the space of all sorts of time, and they're now doing financial transactions that were inconceivable in a way that requires no expensive bank infrastructure or civil service infrastructure or all of those things. That kind of positive technology is quite frankly unstoppable. Our responsibility, if the global market is an inevitability, is how do you regulate it? How do you get an agreement on regulation? How do you get people to buy into it? And how do you enforce it? And what kind of penalties do you have for people who traduce it? Those questions, in some respects, are as old as time. What we just don't have are the current technological solutions to implement them. But to say we don't like the way the world is going in a particular direction, therefore we're going to say stop the world, I want to get off, that's not an option. I think what the European Union can do with the United States and some of the, well, with the major democratic, and they're all democratic in varying degrees, companies or countries within the OECD, is to use the platform of the OECD as the lead force. And if we can do that and get the last round, and you said it earlier on, Nicola, there has been a reversal into the completion of the internal market. I mean, that's a task that we as Europeans need to do. And the new Commission, under the leadership of Jean-Claude Juncker, is the place to start. We've got effectively 4.5 years now to drive the completion of the internal market in a number of ways and to get rid of the silly rules that some people talk about, the straight banana regulation that gets caricatured in the English press, and it is the English press, into proper rules that work for all of us so that we get a really strong regulation a really strongly regulated and well-regulated and intelligently regulated European market. And we haven't gone near TTIPs yet, but that's the other side of it. If ourselves in the United States, and by ourselves I mean the European Union, can actually set standards for regulation within our combined economy of basically 1 billion people, and the richest billion in the world for the time being, that will become the benchmark for everywhere else. The United Nations can't do it, but we can if we want to do it. Now, saying that is very easy for me to articulate here on this platform. Achieving it is going to be extremely difficult. But we've achieved an awful lot already that many people thought were impossible. The end of the nuclear threat seemed to be an impossibility, and yet it happened. So I wouldn't rule out these things from happening. But somebody desperately wants them to happen at political level in a certain part of the advanced end of the world or portion of the world. And certainly in terms of globalized trade, it is in Europe's interest and the United States' interest, and by that I mean the North Atlantic Free Trade Area, NAFTA. That body alone, if you were to drive, and most of them are in the OECD, I think Chile is already a member, soon to become a member, but they will be there. That cohort alone of the global market would be a sufficient driving force to set standards to which other participants would have to adhere to if they wanted to participate in the markets, and that would be worth it.
Thanks, Rory. So maybe to move on to another theme which has been touched on quite a few times. We talked about competitiveness there, and it was I think somebody described it as the concept of civic duty, and I'm particularly talking about corporations here to pay tax, or whether they should be minimizing profits to their investors. And one way of looking at this again is that it's a zero-sum game. And I must admit, I've often been confronted with this when somebody says, what's the right level of tax for a company to pay? And I say, well, how much do you want me to take off the Americans to give to the Italians? Because if you can tell me what the number is or what the percentage is, I can certainly craft the law to do it. But that is one slightly flippant, but I think view that has some truth in it. Another view is to say, well, companies, they have a personality and they should pay tax, and there is a right level of tax that they should be paying. And I know some of our clients say, we know that 0 isn't the right answer, but we don't know what is the right answer. Is it 5, 10, 15, 25, 35, or 40%? We don't have the answer to that. But I'd be interested in the panelists' views on whether in this competitive environment with all the evolutions, whether at some point we will evolve towards a fair level of tax, and maybe it's in the OECD, as you mentioned, Rory, everyone gravitates towards a level, maybe it's some other forum, or will it just remain purely a competitive matter where if there's one country there prepared to give 0, everyone will gravitate towards 0. So views welcome on that. I'm going to let Jim come in at the end on this, but in the meantime I'd like to get...
When I became Minister for Finance, an old friend of mine introduced me to a wonderful phrase that I used on numerous occasions. Many of you will be familiar with it. I think Mr. Colbert was it Louis XIV's Minister for Finance? Had a very successful period in the reign of France. And he described the art of taxation as the plucking of a goose whose quill was used for pens before Mont Blanc. The plucking of a goose with the minimum of hissing, the minimum of noise, the minimum of pain. And in many senses, and I've been a partner in an architectural practice and we had to deal with tax and all of it, what used to cause most of the hissing in my experience was the extraordinary, contradictory, detailed data that you had to provide in order to qualify or to maximize your entitlement, to minimize it. So we all focus on the headline rate because that's the easiest thing to comprehend. But the simplicity of its comprehension and application would, in my view, reduce a lot of the hissing and reduce a lot of accountancy and tax accountancy costs as well.
Well, I think Jim said something before that is extremely important, and I fully would like to endorse that taxes are necessary. Taxes are what finance our children's schools. Taxes are what, finances our roads. Taxes are what finances our security. Taxes are what finances our health system. So taxes are not an evil that we simply have to live with, but it's something that is necessary in every society. That is point one. Point two is, however, I don't think the real problem lies with defining a tax rate that would be the fair tax rate. I think the problem really lies more with the 2,564 pages of rules that compose whatever tax code there is, because that is where the real problem lies. And if we simplify this to the extreme, let me ask, let us do a little poll here. How many of you have had or either still are having a mortgage for their house or for whatever else, of which the interests they write down from their tax return? So, I think in most countries, for instance, when you take on a mortgage for your house, you can write down the interest for your that you pay from the taxes that you would otherwise pay on your salary. The same thing goes with whatever contribution you make for a voluntary pension scheme. In the US, it's called the 401k. No? I think lots of people among you, in this bank, they sell products that you can buy to insure your pension scheme, so on and so on. Even for individuals like us, there are a lot of ways that the tax rate that you would normally pay can be reduced by other expenses that you have, investments that you do, donations you do, whatever, which have a counterpart. For corporations, well, it's the same, just much more complex. And the problem thus does not lie with what they do. It lies in the rules that have been defined. And these rules may be utterly complex and allowing, by combination of the rules of various countries, to arrive at a result that is in no relationship whatsoever with the profits that are made. And that is what triggered the outcry in LuxLeaks. There is nothing in the whole LuxLeaks story that is peculiarly Luxembourgish. Some of the journalists that I talked to very frankly told me why they were hitting so hard at Luxembourg. Well, it's because the documents are from Luxembourg. They show an example from Luxembourg. Unfortunately, we don't have any other example, they told me. Yes, good, okay, fine, but if these documents had been stolen at PwC London, at Deloitte Paris, at KPMG Frankfurt, or at Ernst & Young New York, I think they would look very much the same. That is simply the result of globalization that Rory referred to many times, and the complexity of not only the growing complexity of national rules, but you add to that the international layer. And that makes for tax schemes of corporations looking more like the switchboards of high-rise buildings than anything else.
Kevin, do you have a view on that? Is there a fair tax rate for corporations?
Well, it worries me that someone, according to your anecdote, contacted their accountant to ask them what's the fair rate to pay. I think if you're talking about fairness, you have to look. If you're talking ethics, ethics don't come from accountants; they come from values, and I think it has to be a value-based judgment. If that's the question, I just maybe slightly humorously, I had another colleague in the finance ministry who he divided tax avoidance into 3 categories. There was the first, which was acceptable avoidance, in other words, within the rules and expected. The second was messing, which was a bit borderline, and the third was, taking the piss altogether, which was extreme. And he didn't think that people, whatever the law, should take the piss altogether.
Well, Kevin started it, so I'm allowed to say this then. Mark Cuban, this is very un-Oxfam, and we're still being recorded, are we? Who owns the is it the Dallas, whatever, the big American football club? He said, go out there and make a shitload of money and do something with it, but then be patriotic. Go out there, get rich, get obnoxiously rich. And when the tax bill comes through, your first thought will be to choke on how big a check you have to pay. The second thought will be, isn't that a great problem to have? I suppose I kind of refer back maybe, I don't think we know what the perfect tax rate is, and it's not certainly our intention to suggest that you overly tax corporations to a point where they are no longer interested in, an investment doesn't happen. I mean, jobs and wealth creation should lift everybody out of poverty. I think I'd refer to Piketty, though, in terms of the wealth and capital tax versus income tax. I mean, what we know has happened, and one of the reasons that these two things are moving in opposite directions is that wealth and capital are not taxed anything near the rate that revenue is and that income is. So I think that part of the equation is one that needs to be solved.
Thank you. Okay, at this point, can everyone hear me, by the way? Without a microphone. At this point of the evening, we'd allowed some time for questions from the floor, or I'm not sure if Conor has got any through the miracles of tweets or whatever else, but let's start off with some from the floor. And there is a microphone here if anyone has a question to the panel in general or any specific members of it.
Hi.
And if I could just ask you if you could just briefly identify yourself to explain who you are and your context, if there is one to the question.
Okay. My name is Damiano De Michele. I work for JP Morgan here in Luxembourg. Just was curious to hear your opinions. One question, we have started talking about single market and single currency. So do you see happening an harmonized system for tax, a fiscal union in the EU? Sorry, can you see a fiscal union within the European Union, so an harmonized tax system, or is that out of the question?
I think it's an excellent question on a lot of people's lips. Rory, as a man who was a Minister of Finance, would you see that in the future?
Nothing that is currently in the European Union was forecasted in any of the federal confederations that have come into existence. And when the United States was established, and it was the first federal union, and you go back to the 1680s for the nation state as we understand it today, and yet civilization of Italy, of France, of this part of the world is much older than those places, and there were rules and regulations and governance. So I don't want to keep on repeating this point, but it has to be hammered home. This is a work in progress. This is an evolution. Globalization is taking in greater and bigger numbers. The Americans and the Australians had the advantage that they didn't have to consult the local indigenous people when they built their new federal states. We don't have that possibility on the continent of Europe. And we've had our civil wars before we had our European Union. And the legacy of those civil wars are very strong. Will there be some kind of European Union levied tax that will be collected at a central level and redistributed? Not in the form that it exists in a federal state or in a unitary state, but we already have that. We have it with the Common Agricultural Policy, we have it with the social policies and with the regional policies where monies are collected in various ways and redistributed to other people for objective reasons. The harmonization of VAT in the manner that it is a classic story of wanting to have a single VAT rate, that was the opening objective, right across the union at the time, which was 9 member states and then 12, and it then got into a compromise. And we have a VAT rate now that most people don't challenge. And it is there and it works, and it's a much better system of taxation than the sales tax in the United States, for example, or the turnover tax that we used to have in the Republic of Ireland many years ago. So what I do see as being essential is the federal budget of the United States, or any federal country, is, depending on how you measure some components, is between 15 and 20%. The equivalent federal budget in the European Union is 1.7 maximum, or is it 1.1? I think, and it's not even the last budget that was the first budget in modern times that was less than the previous budget. It's certainly less than 1.25 of GDP. And I don't think you can run something as complicated as the European Union on that kind of a level of budget. Now, how we get there and what way we go there, bigger countries paying for it in times of recession simply wasn't politically opportune, but we won't be in recession forever. In fact, we're coming out of it now. And I think you will see that moving upwards, and you'll be able to get those areas. But the biggest opposition to any kind of increased taxes in our individual regions, in our member states, and in the European Union is the waste of taxpayers' money perceived on the ground and the corruption associated with it. And you won't, as I say, this is a politician, you won't get citizens willing to contribute more directly or indirectly, because it comes out of their pocket, if they feel that that money is either being wasted or corruptly diverted into other quarters. So we're back to the efficiency side of the taxation system as much as the quantum of how much you get and from where you get it.
Nicola, do you have a view on that? Tax harmonisation? Not especially. I mean, I'd give one view on it because it's something we get asked by American clients in particular all the time. I mean, my view is within the currency union, certainly within the Eurozone, there's very little chance, and that may sound paradoxical because you might expect more within the currency union. I think it's actually the opposite. Because if you look at it now, you're a state, you don't really control your interest rate policy, you don't control your currency. They're the two big levers you had before to control your economy. So after that, what do you have left? Within EU law, because of the state aid rules, you can't have selective advantages. You can't design a system to prop up your car industry. That's not allowed, it's selective. So what you're left with really is your tax policy, your general tax policy. And my view is that member states will fight tooth and nail to preserve that remaining piece of sovereignty in economic matters, because otherwise, to some extent, they're moving into a system that they don't have control over. And coming back to I think the political point, if you have to go and try and explain to your electorate that you've lost complete control over your economy, I think that's a step that no politician's going to take. One man's view. Are there any other questions from the floor?
Good evening, Pierre-Antoine Cléty from Lions and Luxembourg. My question was, since we have small countries like Ireland and Luxembourg, which do not need 100 hospitals or 200,000 kilometers of roads, isn't it natural that Luxembourg or Ireland need less tax intakes and therefore are more competitive from a fiscal point of view, and therefore isn't fiscal competitiveness or fiscal competition something inherent in our global system without even considering fairness questions?
Not sure who wants to take a crack at that one. Go on, Nicola.
Well,
Luxembourg doesn't need any roads or hospitals, so therefore there's going to be tax competition.
I was going to ask why exactly you think that Luxembourg would proportionately need fewer hospitals, shorter roads, less of an airport. I really fail to understand the logic of that. It's not because we are smaller that we need less of everything and thus have more money available, or let's put it that way, a few smaller money needs. No, I think we have exactly the same needs. We are part, for instance, of the same defense alliances with the same defense budget requirements that other countries have. So I don't see where the premise of your question would even be given, so I cannot answer the question.
I didn't mean it proportionally, but a big country with more population has more in absolute terms, has more needs. But so Luxembourg, for example, does not need a hospital in every village of Luxembourg. So financing one hospital is logically less costly than financing 100 hospitals to make it easy.
Yeah, but you still need as many hospital beds per 1,000 inhabitants, and you need as many schools per children. I mean, so full stop. There is no...
Yeah, maybe that's one that could be carried on afterwards over a drink. I think there's two retrenched positions on the numerator and the denominator. Conor, I think you might have a question in from the ether, as it was.
The Twitter machine is working. So a question here basically to the panel, which has now disappeared because somebody else has sent one in. 1 second. Does the panel advocate the upfront clarification of corporate taxes payable, or should they be opaque? So basically, I think it's, should corporate taxes be fully transparent or should they be opaque?
Yeah, if I could try and clarify that question, because I think I can guess where it's coming from. I think it's probably more a view on whether for the individual taxpayer they should be allowed to clarify their taxes up front with the tax authority, so by obtaining a ruling or an advance pricing agreement, etc., or does that suggest that there's something wrong and there should be more discretion left to the tax authorities to assess companies? Any views on that, gentlemen?
I think they should be transparent. In the Republic of Ireland, many people who have slightly different sources of income are encouraged to go directly to the revenue commissioners and to say, here is my position, I'm a salaried employee with a company, but I've come into some extra money, or my wife has a part-time job, or my daughters are paying rent to the house. How do I arrange my affairs? Because I want to be tax compliant. And those officials, at no cost to the taxpayer, will say your exposure and your liability under the law as it is, as we interpret it, is the following.
That's a ruling.
And that's the ruling, yeah. And if a clarification/ruling, an interpretation of a person's liability over a number of different areas of tax due, they can go to an accountant, or in our situation, they can go at no cost to themselves directly to and in fact the revenue commissioners encourage that, because the public relations policy of the revenue commissioners over successive chairpersons of the revenue commission has been to make it user friendly and a place where people can actually have confidence in approaching and seeking clarification and questions.
Yeah, and I think this has been the policy in Luxembourg for many years as well, Nicolas, to actually allow taxpayers to get clarity and transparency in their relationships with the tax authorities as well. So I think to some extent it's probably a non-contradictory question. I see somebody else up there with another question. Yeah,
yeah, my name is Bernard Bigger. This is a personal question and it's addressed to Jim Clarkin. Assuming that we have a fair taxation system across the board and transparency across the board, how do you ensure that the actual money that is so raised by developing countries is actually redistributed to the people that are most in need of that money? Because I get the impression until you do something about the corruption in third world countries, and this is not being pejorative, the funds so raised will not actually go to the people who are most in need.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I think this is a classic question, if you don't mind me saying, in this kind of space. And it's one that kind of can make the blood boil a little bit, but I absolutely understand why you're coming at it or where you're coming from it. My other Irish panelists will forgive me from saying, because I'm not going to comment on Luxembourg, I don't know you guys well enough. But believe it or not, we've had corruption in Ireland. I know it comes as a huge shock. And we've had the ability to avoid and evade tax and to do a whole load of other things over generations. And then we got better at it, and then we got caught, and then we changed, and finally maybe we're starting to think differently, or maybe not. Corruption is endemic everywhere. What if it is allowed to happen? And I think that it is very much prevalent in many developing countries. There's no point in pretending that it isn't. No more than it would have been in Ireland or Luxembourg, perhaps, as we were developing and as we were evolving. And until such time as we put systems in place to prevent it from happening, and until such time as we invested in those and also invested in civil society oversight and other oversight of the political process and of the fiduciary systems. I'll give an example of a recent success, which doesn't sound like a success at the start. I won't name the country, although it's probably public information, Rory knows where I'm talking about. The Irish aid budget, of which Ireland is quite a generous contributor, was invested in a particular country, and it was identified that there had been a fraud of about between 4 and 5 million euros. And this could potentially have really damaged the aid effort and the kind of public support for aid and development, which is very strong in Ireland, as it obviously is here. In actual fact, you will be surprised to hear that it was the authorities of that country that identified the problem. It wasn't the donor, it wasn't an external investigator, it was actually the authorities. And those authorities had been developed with the support of the Irish aid budget in the first place. So I mentioned earlier, investing in tax systems and investing in oversight in developing countries is possibly the most impactful use of the donor dollar in many ways. And it has to build, and you have to bring society with you, and you have to encourage whistleblowing and encourage participation by society, and gradually moving beyond the kind of favor for the neighbor, which is probably what we would have been most familiar with, in terms of the political space, to these larger scale corruptions. But it is a process, it's a journey, and it is intolerable, but it exists. And the way to deal with it is to invest in structures and ensure that the media is strong, is independent, to ensure that the opposition parties in politics are strong or independent, and that civil society is strong and has a robust voice to challenge decisions that may be made because of some corrupt leaning.
Are there any other questions from the floor? If not, what I might do is, I'm going to ask, we're wrapping up now over the next 5-10 minutes. So what I'd like to do is maybe ask each member of the panel just to really summarize what they feel is the most important points that have come out this evening in their opinion, and what is it they'd like to leave the audience with in mind as we head off to have a little drink and discuss this some further. So let's start again in time-honored fashion from my right onwards. Rory, do you want to start?
I don't want to be repetitious of what I've already said, but I think what I've taken from this discourse and the exchange of views here and queries that have been raised from the audience is that I don't think that Luxembourg has been damaged by the LuxLeaks. That what has emerged, as Nicola has said, is nothing that is not you wouldn't have found in any other parts of the European Union or by extension of the rest of the world. But it brings me back to the point that we need transparency and we need some clarification and we need harmonization of the way in which corporation tax is applied to multinational companies who have the resources and the purchasing power to shop around for the best advice in the best location to move their transactions and their activities. Individual nation states can't do that. We need to have a framework of rules that are recognized by the major countries so affected, and that's the OECD as far as I'm concerned. And we need to recognize that this is a problem that is causing great offense. It is creating great offense to citizens who see large companies. We've had this in the run-up to the European elections. Anger from ordinary citizens seeing reductions in public expenditure on the one hand and massive tax evasion on the other. Are companies legally being able to manipulate domestic laws between one or two jurisdictions to the effect that they pay a small percentage of the taxes that small indigenous businesses will pay? And that should be, and I say this as a politician, should be an impetus to people charged with that responsibility and the new European Commission under the leadership of Jean-Claude Juncker and Pierre Moscovici and others to actually grab this particular nettle by the throat and say we're going to clean it up in Europe. And by cleaning it up in Europe to put pressure on other parts of the developed world through the OECD to get an improvement on the present chaotic system that is unacceptable. It is clearly unacceptable. We won't get a perfect system, but we will get a significant improvement, and that will be the next step up the ladder that we can legitimately aspire to climb. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I fully subscribe to what Rory has said. First of all, on the need for transparency. I think I've said it a couple of times already this evening. And then second, on the need to perfect the set of rules. And by the set of rules, I also mean what I talked about initially, the European Union's single market, where probably the European institutions, and first of all the Commission, should maybe play their role more forcefully in also making sure that economies like Ireland's and Luxembourg's, which are open economies, which are economies that live by and of and for the single market, can thrive. Luxembourg is a very open economy. It's in fact, it's the embodiment of the European Union's single market with a workforce that is not only more than 50% non-national, but that every day receives 160,000 people from other countries, with its economy being completely turned towards the European single market. And that is something that the European Commission also needs to support.
Well, I just add that it's wonderful that we all agree, but of course, it's a very particular group and a very particular audience. Not everyone outside agrees. So I think all of us across all of Europe need to be a little bit open to what people are complaining about and see whether there's any truth in it and see whether we can address it in a way that is positive for our citizens.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to say thanks again for having me here. We like to consider ourselves, Oxfam, to be a reasonable voice from our side of the fence, if you will, and dealing with the real politic. And this evening has certainly helped me to further frame the way we've been thinking. But I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. I mentioned the Millennium Development Goals at the start, and they were signed in 2000, and they will be completed, or at least the deadline is September of this year. And during the last 15 years, we have reduced extreme poverty in the world by 50%. We've reduced maternal mortality in half. We've cut it in half. 90% of all children are now going to school. And there are 9 million children alive today that would not have been had this global agreement and global effort by all of us as taxpayers, as citizens, and developing countries working together, had that not happened. And it's something to celebrate. And this year we will be looking to sign the Sustainability Development Goals. And this particular compact will include all countries, including our own, looking to try and see where the world will move in the next 15 years as we try to come up with sustainable development within the planetary boundaries for us all. and it is critical to us all. But within that 15 years, up to 2030, hopefully we'll all be around and we'll be able to celebrate it, we could realistically eliminate extreme poverty. I mean, that's something to hold on to. This could be the generation to eliminate extreme poverty. It's very realistic based on the current trajectory. That the one thing that we see may hold this back are climate change and extreme inequality. And what we want to see happen is that the kind of discussion that we've had this evening will continue to evolve and to ensure that this driving inequality that's holding us back to take hold. That, you know, that when we consider taxation, whether it be corporates or the state, it is the citizens' money. It's our money. It is the money that will be invested in this sustainability, invested in lifting people out of poverty, invested in continuing that we enjoy the prosperity that we've had. And one thing that might surprise you is that from an Oxfam perspective, I absolutely believe that the private sector, industry and commerce will lift far more people out of poverty than we ever will. Through creating jobs, through creating wealth, through developing technologies that challenge the issues that hold people back. The future of the developing world is very much through progressive development led by countries and industry and commerce, supported by civil society. So this is an absolute win-win. We just need governments and we need corporates to behave responsibly, to work with citizens, to realize that if you pay your taxes, if you contribute to society in the way that you can and should, actually you're creating sustainable markets for your products. You're developing educated, healthy workforce to produce your product. You're developing consumers that will then consume it. So the future is certainly looking in that direction. It's being positive about what we can achieve together and reaching out to that destination, which isn't that far away, which is very much possible. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I have the difficult task of bringing this evening to a close. What I find fascinating is it's 8:30 in the evening, we're talking about tax and nobody's asleep. Which I think, first of all, is a huge credit to all our panelists. So I'd like you to give them all a big round of applause, please. I'd like to say a special word of thanks to the Irish-Luxembourg Chamber of Commerce for organising this event. So to Joe, the chairman, and all the team, and all the people who've worked hard on this. And I think I was going to do a 5-minute summary of everything we'd heard, but I think we've heard so much already, and it is 8:30. I wouldn't want to stretch your patience any further. So I think, Joe, we have some final words. Which is a gift for our visitors. Thank you for coming to Luxembourg. And now I think the easiest part of the evening is for me to, I think, Joe, just invite everyone to join us for a drink outside and to continue the discussion. Thank you.